Today we're going to talk about the War of 1812 and the presidencies of Madison and James Monroe from 1809 to 1825. So, James Madison, as being a part of the Virginia elites, was elected in 1808 presidential election. He was a founding father who was very important in the role of ratification of Bill of Rights. He studied and worked with Thomas Jefferson very closely to develop, the different aspects that would become essential for the United States Constitution. Just to give some background information, because the War of 1812 will be very important for our conversation today, Madison served as the Secretary of State from 1801 to 1809. This was a very tough time for the world in general, and especially in Europe and America, because the Napoleonic Wars were going on. And so he had to get through that situation without a lot of assistance as controlling of an up-and-coming power. With that being said, this experience would be profitable for him because he actually took the role of the Secretary of State after his appointed cabinet member, Robert Smith, did not do a good job at being Secretary of State, negotiated poorly, and thus was replaced, and Madison basically took over that role. And this would be very consequential. So, to lead up of Madison's first term, the United States and Great Britain were not getting along in the aftermath of the Great American Revolution. In fact, the United Kingdom had closed off the trade between the Americans and British in the profitable Caribbean colonies and other aspects of the United Kingdom. And it also closed them off from things they needed to import in order to manufacture goods locally. So this caused a lot of tension beginning in this 19th century. With that being said, they did try to negotiate in the hectic times of the Napoleonic era, like I mentioned before, but this did not go through simply because things were moving way too fast. With that being said, however, one important aspect the Madison administration had to address early on was the failure of the first bank in the United States. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the First Bank of the United States was seen as a way to negotiate with foreign powers over money, because it was seen as if one state such as New Jersey had a loan, they could easily just say, oh, you can't deal with us because we don't want to deal with you anymore. You can't cheat a foreign power if you're New Jersey. But if you're dealing as the United States, you're not going to get out of that. And so it gave the foreign powers a sort of legitimacy, a sort of prestige in order to work with the United States. And that was very helpful because, as we're going to see, issues with financing will be very pertinent in the early American Republic. So, the foundations of the War of 1812. On June 1st, 1812, James Madison, surprisingly, a very quiet man compared to the rest of the founding fathers, such as George Washington, even Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, he actually asked Congress for war against the United Kingdom, which was very surprising, not something that people would expect. And some put this consequence of the pro-war party led by the Southern and Western delegations of people, rising stars such as John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, who in some instances would be sort of seen as a triumphant, like in ancient Rome times, because they had a lot of power, especially with the upcoming Whig Party and dealing with the demise of the Federalists. Okay. And the rise of the Democrats and Republicans. So Madison still believed that the states were going to contribute a lot to the War of 1812 and just defending the country in general. So they thought that most of the military was going to come from the state militias. Well, this did not happen, and this was very consequential for the United States. So just to give some preface, James Madison, during this time, he happened to have an election year, and now most people would not be happy with war. But you have to remember at this time that the only people who were allowed to vote were white property owners. So if you're an average person who cares about war and destruction and so forth, your opinions didn't really matter at this point. It was whether or not the people who had authority cared enough to elect you. And since this war was seen as justified and towards their interests, they re-elected James Madison easily. So I wanted to bring up some battles that were very important for the United States in this time period. One of which was the Battle of Lake Erie, in which the United States Navy defeated the British naval forces and cut off their supply to Montreal and the Western Theater. A map I'm going to show is going to show why this was important. All these battles were occurring on this area, this Great Lakes, this New York, this even Lake Champlain in Vermont, but this was a big theater. So to cut them off from supplies was ultimately going to cement their demise, at least in that part of the war. In addition, other politicians got notoriety at this point. General William Henry Harrison, the future 9th President of the United States, defeated the UK and Tecumseh's Confederacy. Tecumseh, he had formed an Indian Confederacy within the Northwest, and it was seen as the last major organization for the Native Americans. And so once they were defeated, there really wasn't a substantial organization similarly afterwards. So with Harrison's victory, that really tore apart the coalitions that were being built, especially in the Northwest. So that happened. And Andrew Jackson, the famous guy we all know, he got one of his major victories at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama in March 1814. So just to put it in perspective, some key pivotal battles were even being fought in the southern United States, even though the major war battle started in the north. So here's a map, and as you can see, in this area right here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but in the north area around the border of Canada and Michigan, a lot of the major battles were being fought in this portion. But if you notice, as time progresses, you can't see it very well, but this is where Andrew Jackson made his claim. And then eventually he would go to New Orleans to win a very important battle for the United States that would determine outcomes of the treaty after the war. So I explained some of the victories for the United States, but now I'm going to talk about some of the setbacks. There was a fort on Niagara Falls around, and it was taken in 1813. From there, the British decided to burn Buffalo to the ground, Buffalo, New York. They also decided to move from there to attack Washington, D.C., or what would become Washington, D.C., that area. And they also burned down a large portion of the White House in addition to other things. Interesting enough, there is some cultural history around this event that was very important because not only was there a tornado that went through the town at the same time as this event was occurring, but when the White House was on fire, Dolly Madison, in addition to the family slaves, decided to save as much artwork as possible. And from this, a man in his late 80s would write about this, Paul Jennings. In the 1860s, he would write about his experiences being a 15-year-old boy during the White House burning. And so he actually was recently honored in the White House, and I believe it was in 2009 under the Barack Obama administration. What is also interesting, though, is that the British could be bought. Alexandria, on the other side of the Potomac River, was raided, but the mayor decided to negotiate and say, don't burn down our city, we'll pay you off. And the British bought it, because the British at this time were very much about their generals, and they had a lot of independence that they wouldn't have later on. So, because of this situation, the area called the Old Brick Capital served as the capital from December 1815 to 1819 of December. The British, from their attack of the White House in that general area, went to Baltimore next to attack another major city, but they were beaten, and by September they had to retreat. From these defeats in the battles of Lake Champlain and of Baltimore, the British public did not agree with the war. So there was actually a temporary peace signed in December of 1814, but because of the nature of slow mail, there was a battle in January of 1815 of New Orleans between I think it was about 900 soldiers on Andrew Jackson's side, and he fought many more soldiers. He and his soldiers fought them, and he defeated them. And so there was actually plans and documentation that shows that there were some elements in Parliament that wanted to annex New Orleans had they taken it. So this was very important because the very next month, in February of 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was signed and status quo was established. So considering that the Americans had done poorly beginning in the war, they managed to basically win enough to the point where the British would leave them alone and they would go back to how it was. This is a photograph of the old brick Capitol. At this time, this was from the Civil War, I believe in the mid-1860s. It was actually being used as a prison, ironically enough. And so they imprisoned people who were spies or other undesirables at that time period, and that could include just about anybody who was controversial at that time. So if you weren't a Union partisan, you may have ended up in the jail in Washington, D.C. So the elements of this, so eventually the 14th Congress, after the war ends, gathers, and basically Madison realizes the federal government needs more power, and so they push for more spending, tariffs, and so on. They actually inaugurated the second bank of the United States in February 1816, and this gave the United States more credibility, at least on the surface. This would be highly contentious for the Western and Southern politicians, including Andrew Jackson, who would go out of his way to destroy it. So from this, the United States uses its time, its victory against the British to defeat people who were going after their interests, such as the pirates in the Mediterranean. And so from these victories, the spending increase was very popular. James Madison was able to support James Monroe, and he was to be elected very easily. So James Monroe was inaugurated March 14th, 1817. At this time, despite the War of 1812 establishing status quo, there's still a lot of arguments over the West, and it actually caused a panic of 1819 because people thought they were going to get in when things were more chaotic, and it actually caused the U.S. economy to have significant issues. James Monroe, in his course, did not bail the people out for this. He did not really assist them. And interesting enough, there was also more issues involving the West as well at this point. So there was a fundamental case, McCulloch versus Maryland. The state of Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States for their money so they could raise money. And basically, the Supreme Court said you can't do that and that you cannot infer on federal government's implementation of the Constitution. This did not stop the hectic times as things progressed. So eventually we had the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It admitted the slave state of Missouri and the free state of Maine. Maine had broken off from Massachusetts. And so from these signs, the compromise at this time was seen as fairly amicable. It wasn't seen as a problem, as scholars of slavery and U.S. Civil War would later find out. So by this point, Monroe was elected in election of 1820 with no opposition. So to go back to the United Kingdom, there was a couple of treaties signed with them, including the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817. As I mentioned before, a lot of the battles had dealt with on the Great Lakes. Well, this treaty limited naval deployment on the Great Lakes. And so this kind of calmed things down in general for people. And so this kind of settled a long-standing issue. In addition, because of this foundation, the Treaty of 1818 was set, and it actually set the current border with Canada, for the most part, at the 49th parallel. Now, there's going to be a situation with Oregon and Washington, but for the most part, this mostly settled the issue. Andrew Jackson, taking a key from his victories in Alabama, he decided to make a move against the Spanish and attack the Seminoles in their homeland, and he took the Spanish forts against James Monroe's decided order to do. He was supposed to attack the Seminoles only, but he took Spanish forts, and that was not okay. But eventually, Congress, they tried to court-martial him, but they decided not to because people were saying, hey, this is land for the taking. And so this was accepted by the people, and Jackson got very famous from this. This was a sort of Rubicon moment for him, and he would lead to his eventual presidency. Based off of the events that happened with Jackson and other things in the Seminole War, this led to the Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819, and finally, the long-standing issue of Florida had been settled in the Americans' favor. In Monroe's time, he became more famous for dealing with Latin America, and his most famous thing, to put a story short, is that President Monroe went to his annual address in 1823, and he said that the United States will stay neutral in European conflicts, but you are not allowed to go back into America or colonize further or make more money. We are going to negotiate for the Latin American countries. And at a time where we really didn't have that power to do that, that was pretty bold, but it ended up becoming status quo. In conclusion, from 1809 to 1825, U.S. power and influence increased dramatically. The United States, despite declaring a war it was not prepared for, was able to maintain its borders. It got some prestige from this status quo because many countries couldn't even achieve that in their defense of their homeland, so this was seen as good for the United States. The federal government was good at addressing short-term issues, but long-term issues it was not as good at doing, and we will see issues such as slavery, monetary problems, Western expansion becoming an issue. What was really important about 1812 is that America fundamentally afterwards became Americans. The states were not so much citizens of states, but they became more American, and that was important. So the era of good feelings gave the United States a chance of stability to build upon. All right, thank you.